Yeah, thank you, everyone. I'm very positively surprised by how many people seem to be interested in writing software documentation. So amazing. Thank you. So first of all, how did I come up with the idea of giving a talk about software documentation? I'm part of the Narwhals team and also scikit-learn team. I'll give you some examples from these libraries because I know them best. And so on the Narwhals Discord server, there was a contributor, and the contributor said, could you create a documentation on how to write documentation? I'm always in awe with the docs you create. And I thought that was actually really sweet. And I thought maybe some other people might want to know as well. And if you don't know Narwhals, Narwhals is a lightweight compatibility layer between data frame libraries. And I came up with the title for my talk because often when people write code, they feel good about themselves. They're like, yes, I can do this. I'm really good. And then when they have to write documentation, it's like, how do I do this? Where do I even start? I don't know. And it's similar to earning money. So when people earn money, they feel good about themselves. They're like, yes, I'm earning money. But then when they do their taxes, it's like, why do I have to do this? And like, what is this all about? But yeah, so let's dive in. So first of all, we'll have a look at why writing software documentation is important. Then we'll have a look at what makes good software documentation. And then I'll go over the question of, can AI tools now do the job of documentation? So can we outsource this? And finally, I'll give you some fun examples that hopefully keep you motivated to write software documentation, or hopefully make you start writing software documentation. So here on the right-hand side, there's this, in quote, books. It says, excuses for not writing documentation. And at the top it says, where's the fun in just knowing what the code is supposed to do? And I think this already gives us a hint on why software documentation is important. And first of all, writing documentation is important for yourself. Because I think we've all been in this situation that we thought, I know what this code does. Like, it's very clear in my head. And then a couple of months later, you look at it again, it's like, ooh, what was my thought process here? I certainly have been there. And so you do this to document to yourself and also others what your code does and why it does what it does. And also with that, you can improve your technical writing skills. And so, yeah, by explaining it to your future self, you also explain it to others. And what's really important is that you explain the why behind the code, because from the lines of code, you can often see what it does, but not really why this function is actually really needed. And also you explain to others which kind of problem your project solves, or like which kind of problem a specific function, for example, maybe solves, and also how to use the code. And so in general, writing software documentation is about clarifying intentions behind the code. And it's also often a good starting point for new contributors if it's an open source library, for example. And it's a big open source library. It can be overwhelming to start contributing. So for example, scikit-learn is huge. And when you start with writing documentation, you can find your way around the code base, and that really helps you with understanding the code base before you dive in deeper. And so now that we covered the why, let's have a look at the how-to. And these are the most important aspects that you need to keep in mind. So first of all, there are two types of audiences. First of all, users, people who want to use your code. They might not care so much about how it works internally. And then there are developers, so people who want to actually work on the code base. And so you need to keep these two kinds of people in mind. And then generally, you need to ask yourself the question, what does this code do? Who is this project for? Or what is this code for? And why is this project needed? Or why is this code really needed? So these are the basic questions that you need to keep in mind. And so here I'll give an example from the Narwhals library. This is an overview of the documentation page, or a screenshot of the documentation page. And you can see here at the bottom the question, who is this for? And there's just one sentence, so it's very clear and concise. It shows very clearly who's this project for, and then at the top left part here where the arrow is, you can see the section Why. So if you want to learn more about the project and why it's important and what kind of problems it solves, then you can click on the Why tab. And so it's really clear, really concise, nice overview. So this is a really good example. And then what's also important is to write small reproducible examples. So here, this is a screenshot from the doc strings of the random forest regressor, so the random forest regressor class. And the doc strings of this class is actually 300 lines long, and this is just the example section of this doc string. And so it's important to have more in-depth examples in a separate place. So here, for example, in scikit-learn, you have a gallery, and it shows all the kinds of examples that go a bit more in depth about how to use the random forest regressor. So that's a really good separation. And then what you also need to keep in mind is processes. So first of all, you need to have a contributing guideline because it sets the standards for your projects and it sets the community values. And you also need to have clear installation instructions for people who want to run your code or use your library. And then you also need to think about a project license. It might not matter so much to you, but it might matter to other people who want to use your code. And generally, it's advised to only use one license because otherwise this might get confusing. And then you also need to think about support, like how do you provide people with support, and you need to document that. So when your code is hosted on GitHub or GitLab, for example, there's generally an issue tracker where people can submit bugs. So you need to document that. And you also need to document how people can interact with the community, where can they ask questions, if they want to use your code or contribute to your code. And so you need to document, for example, mailing lists, Discord servers, or whatever kind of interaction you can provide for people who want to either use your code or work on your code base. And so here I show an example from the scikit-learn library. Here there's a screenshot of the contributing guideline. And there's a gray box which says our community, our values, which is really good because then you get an idea of what the general vibe is like. And you can see like, okay, is this project really welcoming and inclusive? And then also at the bottom where the red arrow is, you can see a link to an issue tracker. So this is also a really good example of documentation. And I'm also going to show you another example from the Narwhals library. So here you have the installation instructions, and you are given the option of either installing Narwhals using UV or Python's virtual environment. But regardless of what you use, the installation instructions are very clear and they fit into this one screenshot. And generally, if you need more information, there are some links that you can click on. So here you just keep a very simple overview that people can follow. And that is also a really good example. And so now, the I think most interesting part maybe, the question, can AI tools write documentation? Can we just outsource writing documentation? And so what I did was I went into the scikit-learn library and I deleted some documentation and I said to GitHub Copilot, please write me some documentation. So first of all, I deleted the doc strings, the example doc strings from the random forest regressor in scikit-learn. It's the same example that I just showed before. And then I said to GitHub Copilot, okay, please write a small reproducible example of the random forest regressor, of how to use a random forest regressor. And so this is what came out. You can see this here on the right-hand side, and it looks pretty good. First of all, it's correct, and it has some extra details. It has some inline documentation, and also here we have a train test split, which we don't have in the original example. And that's actually really good because it makes it very clear to users that you should not use your whole data set for training machine learning models. And then also at the end, we are calculating an R2 score, which is really good. So by looking at it, the example on the right-hand side actually looks better. But as I said, the doc strings of the random forest regressor is already 300 lines long. Do you want it to be even longer? Does anyone even read the docstring if it's longer? Or do people just feel overwhelmed? So it's a bit of a question of what's best for users. So you really need to think about like, okay, do I really want to make the documentation longer, or is it maybe better to keep it really concise and have a more in-depth example somewhere else, as I said before? So I talked about this with the scikit-learn maintainer, and he was saying, actually, I prefer the original example because we have loads of more in-depth examples somewhere else. And then what I did was that I deleted the n-estimators parameter documentation from the random forest regressor, and I said to GitHub Copilot, okay, please document this parameter for me. And this is what came out. So on the left-hand side, we can see n_estimators. It's an integer, default equals 100, and then a short description, the number of trees in the forest, and then some information about when this was changed. And you can see the exact same information on the right-hand side in the AI-generated param docs. But then there's a bit of a middle part. And in the middle part, it says, increasing the number of estimators can improve model performance, but also increases training time and memory usage. For small data sets, a lower value may suffice, while larger values are often beneficial for more complex data sets. I looked at it and I was like, this is kind of obvious, isn't it? But maybe it's not so obvious to people who just started with using scikit-learn or just started using code to code. And so maybe it's actually really valuable information for more junior developers. And so I thought, I guess it's useful to have this kind of information, but maybe not in the docstrings of the estimators, because the docstrings are already so long. And then it also says here the default value is 100. This is redundant because at the top we can already see default equals 100. So this was this example. And then I thought, okay, maybe let's document a whole function. So here on the left-hand side, we have this function. Oh, sorry, not a function. It's a method actually, which you can't see here. It's a method called getParams. And it has some docstrings, and I deleted the docstrings and said to GitHub Copilot, please document this method. And the output looks pretty similar. So the description is get parameters for this estimator, and the GitHub Copilot did exactly the same, generated exactly the same, and it also documented the parameter deep exactly the same as it was before. So in the scikit-learn code base, there is another documentation of deep in another method, and GitHub Copilot probably just copy-pasted that and put it in here. And then when we look at the returns, we see that the method returns params, which is a dictionary, and then the description is parameter names mapped to their values. So this is identical to the original docstring. But then we have some extra information, and the extra information is, if deep equals true, we'll return parameters of nested estimators as well, with keys of the form component __ parameter. And the extra information here is actually really valuable, I find, because it wasn't so clear. Like, yes, you can see that from looking at the function, but you really would have to look at it line by line, think about it. And so having this extra piece of information is actually quite valuable, and I think the AI-generated docstring is actually better in this case, like a little bit better. And so, in summary, going back to our question, can AI tools write documentation? I would say in clearly defined environments, yes. But there's a caveat. So they cannot go beyond training data and the context that they're operating in, and so they cannot be creative and they cannot create new ideas. They cannot be like, hey, you know what would be really cool? It would be really cool to have this kind of library that solves this kind of problem. This is not happening. And then AI tools also tend to produce a lot of output with sparse information density. So they often produce a lot of blah, blah with not much content. And so you really need to double check, okay, is the content really clear and concise? Is it really clear? really clearly communicated, or does it maybe confuse people? And so you always need to double check. And you can, of course, improve this a bit with prompt engineering. You can say like, okay, hey, let's take this documentation. Let's say GitHub Copilot generated some documentation, and it's a bit blown up in the sense that it produces not very dense content. And then you can say like, hey, can you please summarize this content for me in 100 words or something like that. And so you can work with that, but still you cannot blindly trust the AI output. And so you always need to double check. And so in summary, AI tools, in my opinion, are good for assistance, but they're not really good for driving something, because you always need to double check whether the output is actually valuable. And so maybe some people have been asking themselves, will technical writers die out due to AI? And in my opinion, no. Because as I said, you always need to keep the target audience in mind, and you really need to understand your target audience well. And AI tools have generally a very limited understanding of the target audience. Of course, you can say like, okay, this is my target audience, and I have some, I don't know, maybe blog post here that describes the target audience, and read the blog post and write some documentation for the target audience. So like you can work with the prompt engineering, you can improve that, but still you need to tell the AI tool what exactly is my target audience. This is not something that the AI tool can do. And the AI tools also generally have a very limited capacity to describe why, or to, as I said, be creative. They can't really be creative. So that's still something that you need to do. And so you always also need to double check the work that they're doing. And so no, in general, technical writers are still needed, and AI tools will not replace them, but assist them in their work. And I wanted to show you this, the Zen of Python. I'm not sure if you know this. And so you can do in Python, import this, and then it spits out this little poem, which starts with beautiful is better than ugly, explicit is better than implicit. You might have seen it. And this inspired some other developers to write their own Zen. So for example, in the narwhals library, there's the Zen of narwhals, which spits out this little poem and a really cute narwhal. And this inspired someone who was contributing to scikit-learn to also write a Zen for scikit-learn, and started an issue, and started with the little poem that he wrote, but no one submitted any suggestions. So he was saying like, maybe someone has any suggestions to improve it. But yeah, the issue is not very active. So if you have some suggestions for writing a Zen for scikit-learn, yeah, suggestions are very welcome. So yeah, have some fun with that. And yeah, these are my references. So I took a lot of information from here, from Write the Docs. It's a really comprehensive library for documentation, and there's even a conference about documentation, just documentation, coming up this year in October in Berlin. And I can also recommend reading Read the Docs. So Read the Docs is a tool for building and hosting documentation, and it can partly automate writing documentation. Or not writing documentation, but like building of documentation. And it builds on Sphinx and Make Docs, which are tools for building documentation. And I can also really recommend to check them out. And there's also this tutorial by Melissa Weber-Mendonça for how to write documentation using Sphinx, and I can really recommend it. And this is the end of my talk. I hope that you learned something, and I hope that you had fun, and if not, at least I did. Thank you.
We have lots of different sources of documentation. What could be a good strategy or tool to aggregate them all? Sources of documentation. The question is, what could be a good strategy or tool to aggregate these sources?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe someone can start a library that gives a good overview, or that maybe integrates a different kind of tools. That would be my answer.
Do you think is faster writing the doc by yourself or improving the prompt to generate the docs with AI?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I recently had a discussion about this with a developer, and we were both saying that it depends. Sometimes it's easier if you just quickly do it yourself, especially if it's just a few lines, because learning to do prompt engineering is also a learning process, and so it takes a bit of learning to it takes a bit of time to learn how to do it properly, and that is a learning process in itself, and you need to be aware of that. And sometimes it's easier to just quickly do it yourself, but in general, it's also good to learn how to improve your prompt engineering.
I'm not too creative in document generation, says Maxim, but documentation should be not creative, it should be documentation, or am I miss something?
Yeah, I mean, there are different kinds of documentation. So often you document what, like for example, if you do parameter documentation, it's fairly straightforward. But then if you need to document who is this project for, or like why is this project needed, then that's really hard to automate. Like you really need to think about it yourself. So there are different aspects of documentation. So especially when you're documenting, very clearly define, when you do documentation in very clearly in very clearly defined environments, then it's easy to automate these things.
How would you handle changes in the source code that affect documentation in multiple locations? In other words, how do you make sure that documentation across the code base is always cross-consistent and up-to-date?
That is a really good question. The speaker before me actually gave a talk about continuous documentation and how to keep your documentation up to date. So I would actually just recommend to check out that presentation. It's by Anastasia Timoschuk, I hope I pronounced it correctly. And I cannot recall the title, but it was something about like continuous documentation and how to do continuous documentation.
Now a tangential question on docstrings. Do you think we still need to include parameters input section if type hints and good variable names are used?
Yeah, I mean, that's also a good question. I think it is always good to have a very quick summary of what a parameter is about, because it might not be so clear, actually. It might be very clear to you, but maybe not so clear to others, especially with people from different backgrounds. So I would always describe parameters with at least one line, like very briefly.
Do you think that the approach to documentation will change with more extensive use of AI-generated code, in particular for projects with specific business goals?
Yeah, I'm sure it will. So we are just at the start of using AI tools, really, and I think this is going to be a field in its own, and I think we're just at the start of the learning curve of how to actually use these tools, and these tools always get improved over time. So yeah, I think it will change a lot, and I think we just have to keep interacting with it and like keep learning, keep figuring out what can these tools do, what are they good for, what are their limitations. So yeah, I think it's going to change a lot, but in a good way, I would say.
We have still room for questions. Do you have any other question? I actually have one. I was here at Anastasia talk, and she was kind of pretty critic about the use of AI because of two reasons. Mainly, one was hallucination. So you save time by having your doc generated, but then you spend a lot of time checking it out because it pretty easily finds something that doesn't exist and put it there for everybody. On the other hand, it has some security issues in a lot of projects. So maybe what do you think about this?
I mean, these are definitely very valid concerns. Yeah, I think you always need to strike a balance between, like when it comes to efficiency, like really strike a balance between, okay, is it better if I just do it myself, or if I have this AI generated and I need to check every single bit of it. And yeah, when it comes to security problems, I'm not an expert in IT security, but I'm certainly sure that this is going to be a problem. And yeah, someone with more expertise in IT security, I think, can answer this question better.
Another question? Wait.
So I have a question. Generally, does every function needs to be documented? So for example, we have some kind of intermediate function that does a lot of things, but for code cleanness, we split it inside into some steps that we do: fetch data, calculate this, and parse the result, for example. So it's obvious that the main function has to be documented well, but do the child functions, which probably are one or two liners, have to have the full set of doc strings that will clutter our code? Thank you.
I think it really depends. So for example, in the scikit-learn library, there are many private functions or methods that are not really documented because only developers look at them and users generally don't interact with them. So generally, for example, in scikit-learn, the public functions and methods, they're documented, whereas the others are not. Yeah, if functions or methods are really short, sure, then yeah, it's a matter of, is this really worth it? When you have a lot of users, when you are an open source project with a lot of users, it might be useful to still do the documentation for completeness. But yeah, sure. I mean, I've been in the position that I looked at something, I was like, okay, is this worth documenting at all? Sure, it's a bit of a matter of like personal preference, maybe.
The last question, maybe.
Thank you for the presentation, first of all. Do you use AI to generate documentation? Do you also use AI to check consistency of documentation?
Very good question. And no, I haven't. And this can be included in a future version of this talk. So thank you.
Yeah. So thank you.